The war had burned across Europe like a fever no one could cool. By the spring of 1944, whole cities lay skeletal under the weight of their own smoke, and the people who survived did so in half-light, eating fear and ration bread by candle stubs. In Cologne, the air itself tasted of iron. Rubble shifted in the wind. Somewhere beneath the soot, a church bell still rang, though its tower was broken. In one gutted street, young women in Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms waited under gray sky, their boots white with ash. They had been radio clerks, typists, code recorders, soldiers without rifles. Their faces bore the pale discipline of those taught that obedience was survival. Yet behind the stillness sat something human. Hunger, fatigue, the memory of home-cooked soup that no longer existed. Trucks rumbled through the ruins, engines coughing. The women climbed in, their suitcases thin as shoe boxes. One carried a rosary, another held a photograph of her little brother. As the convoy rolled west, the horizon glowed faintly where the Rhine burned. None of them knew their destination, only that they were prisoners now, captured with retreating German units in Tunisia months earlier and shuffled through Allied custody like misplaced paperwork. The war had swallowed their futures and was now spitting them across oceans. At a rail junction near Le Havre, they were loaded into American transport cars, marked not by swastikas or eagles but by a white star painted in haste. Outside, GIs smoked Lucky Strikes, their laughter sharp against the murmur of orders. The women exchanged quick glances, astonished by how tall these men were, how casual, how impossibly clean despite the mud. They smelled of soap and gasoline, not fear. One of the women, no more than 22, whispered in disbelief, "They look like they're going to a picnic." Another answered quietly, "Maybe for them, this is peace." The train crept toward the docks, where Liberty ships groaned under the weight of steel and exhaustion. By the time the sun set, the prisoners were herded up gangplanks. Cold Atlantic wind cut through their thin uniforms. A sergeant checked names against a clipboard. Each name sounded foreign on his tongue. Beneath deck, the air turned thick with engine grease and salt. Somewhere above, the American flag cracked like a whip in the wind. For many of the women, this was their first sight of the sea. It was endless, merciless, magnificent, a shifting mirror where Europe disappeared behind them hour by hour. The voyage lasted nearly 2 weeks. Some grew ill. Others stood by the portholes, tracing the constellations that reminded them of home. They were treated with military precision but also with a strange restraint. Rations of canned meat, white bread, hot coffee. One sailor offered an extra blanket to a woman shivering on deck. She thanked him with a nod, words strangled by pride. He smiled and said, "You'll find Texas warmer than this, ma'am." She didn't know what Texas was, but the sound of the word lingered, soft, sunlit, foreign. The ship docked at Newport News under a curtain of rain. Rows of American MPs waited, rifles slung but relaxed. The women stepped onto American soil expecting hostility, perhaps jeers. Instead, they met silence and order. Trucks lined the pier, their canvas flaps open like the pages of a new book. Each vehicle bore a stenciled destination, Hearne, Texas. The name meant nothing, yet the repetition of it suggested finality. As the convoy pulled away, the rain turned to sun somewhere over the Blue Ridge Mountains. Days became a blur of landscapes seen through small windows, forests giving way to plains, cities fading into fields. At every station, curious faces appeared. Farmers' wives, schoolchildren, a man tipping his hat. None spat or shouted. Some even waved. It confused the prisoners. They had been taught to fear Americans as monsters. But the men guarding them joked among themselves, offered gum, played harmonica. One of the Germans, a former nurse named Greta, tried a stick of spearmint and nearly cried from the taste. Fresh, absurdly sweet. When the train crossed into Texas, the world seemed to widen. The horizon stretched without end. Mesquite trees clawed the sky. The air smelled of dust and cattle. The women pressed their faces to the windows, astonished by the brightness. They passed small towns with names they couldn't pronounce. Brenham, Caldwell, Hearne, each one shimmering in the afternoon heat. A sign painted on a barn read, "God bless our boys overseas." Another, "Barbecue every Sunday." The word barbecue meant nothing to them yet, but it flickered like a promise. By evening the train slowed beside a field ringed with barbed wire and wooden towers. The camp was large, tidy, eerily calm. A guard unlocked the doors and motioned them down. Boots hit red dirt. Crickets hummed. Beyond the wire stood rows of barracks, laundry lines, even a small garden. It looked less like a prison and more like a strange little town fenced in by conscience. Inside the camp, the first thing they noticed was the smell, not of gunpowder or rot but of food. Something smoky and warm drifted from a distant kitchen. A few of the women lifted their heads like startled birds. An American corporal led them toward the registration tent, where they were fingerprinted, tagged, and handed metal trays. Supper. They hadn't expected to eat so soon. The meal was simple: beans, cornbread, coffee. Yet it filled the air with a comfort that hurt. They ate in silence, the taste too generous, almost indecent. Later that night, as they lay on cots beneath ceiling fans, they whispered about home, about mothers who still hid in cellars, about hunger that had become a second skin. One said she could still feel the tremor of bombing in her bones. Another confessed she couldn't remember the sound of birds. Somewhere outside, a radio played faint country music, lazy and unbothered, like the heartbeat of another planet. The guards patrolled quietly, their boots scuffing the dust. One of them paused near the barracks, looking in at the rows of sleeping prisoners. They didn't look like enemies, he thought, just tired girls a long way from home. He spat his tobacco, adjusted his hat, and moved on. By midnight the Texas wind had cooled. The women slept fitfully, dreaming of cities without walls, of bread thick with butter, of brothers who might still be alive. In the distance, a train whistle moaned across the plains. It was both farewell and arrival. What none of them knew, what history would barely bother to record, was that this camp, this patch of red soil and wire, would become the place where something remarkable happened. A meal. A mercy. A lesson carved not by generals or treaties, but by fire, by pork fat, by a man with a skillet and a conscience wide as the sky. The Texas sun rose like a brass coin over the horizon, harsh and honest. Its light spilled across the barbed wire fences of Camp Hearn, making the metal glint like threads of fire. The land stretched flat and endless, broken only by mesquite trees and the shadows of watchtowers. Inside the fences, the day began with a whistle, sharp, commanding, the sound of order rising from captivity. German voices answered it, some weary, some defiant, all threaded with the strange rhythm of surrender. By April 1944, the camp was a small city. It held nearly 5,000 German prisoners, tank crews, submarine men, medics, and now, for the first time, a group of women from the Luftwaffe Auxiliary. They were called the Fräuleins by the guards, though no one meant it unkindly. Their arrival had changed the mood of the place. The older prisoners straightened their posture. Young MPs who once leaned lazily in guard towers began to shave twice a day. War had built this camp to contain an enemy, yet life inside it was beginning to resemble something awkwardly human. At the heart of the camp stood the mess hall, a long wooden building that smelled of boiled coffee and smoked hickory. The floorboards creaked under every step. Inside, the walls were lined with army-issued posters. Calorie charts, food safety codes, patriotic slogans that no one really read. This was where the story of mercy would take root. And its unlikely keeper was a man named Earl Whitman. Earl wasn't military. He was a ranch cook turned army hire, a thick-shouldered Texan in his late 40s with sunburned skin and a hat that looked older than the war itself. He had cooked for cattle drives, oil field crews, and once for a rodeo in Waco where he nearly burned down a grandstand with too much kerosene. But he'd never cooked for prisoners, much less women from the other side of the world. His kitchen was a kingdom of noise, clattering pans, slamming oven doors, and the hiss of meat hitting hot iron. His language was simple: work hard, feed everyone, waste nothing. When he first saw the women through the mess hall window, he paused mid-motion. They were standing in line under the Texas sun, their pale blue uniforms faded to gray, their hair braided tight beneath caps. Most were thin, shoulders drawn in like birds afraid to spread their wings. They carried themselves with military restraint, but their eyes gave them away, tired, hollow, uncertain. Earl leaned against the doorframe, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Ain't right," he muttered. "Looks like they've been starved by both sides." The camp commander, Captain Rusk, was a by-the-book man who measured morality in regulations. "Feed them what the Geneva Convention requires," he'd said on their arrival. No more, no less. But to Earl, no more, no less wasn't how a Texan fed anyone. Food, to him, was a declaration of decency. You fed men, or women, or even enemies, the way you'd feed your own, because that's what separated you from the kind of people who bombed cities into silence. He started small. The next morning, he stirred extra butter into the grits, ignored the supply ledger, and replaced the powdered milk with fresh cream from a nearby farm. When the women tasted breakfast, their eyes flickered in disbelief. A few whispered to each other, hesitantly smiling for the first time since capture. Earl noticed from afar, said nothing, but whistled while he worked. Outside, the camp thrummed with an uneasy routine. The women were assigned light labor, sorting linens, tending gardens, sewing uniforms for camp staff. Under the supervision of a corporal named Hensley, they worked silently, faces shaded by handkerchiefs tied beneath their chins. At noon, they were marched to lunch, where the Texas heat made the air ripple. And every day they began to look a little less like prisoners and a little more like survivors. That afternoon, a storm of dust rolled over the plains. The sky turned copper and grit coated the mess hall windows. Earl stood outside, watching the storm swallow the horizon. A young guard beside him spat into the dust and said, "Don't seem right, feeding them good like this. My brother's still in Europe, fighting their kind." Earl's jaw tightened. "Son," he said, his voice low but steady, "if your brother's fighting for what's right, then this," he gestured to the kitchen, "is part of what's right." The guard said nothing more. As evening fell, the camp quieted. From the women's barracks came faint music, a harmonica, perhaps borrowed from a guard. Earl listened from his porch, the melody mingling with the chirp of cicadas. It sounded fragile, foreign, and heartbreakingly human. The next morning, he made a decision. Sunday was coming, and Sunday meant barbecue. He sent word to the supply depot for pork shoulder and beans, ignoring the questioning looks of the quartermaster. He cleaned the old iron smoker behind the kitchen until it shone like a cannon barrel. By dawn, mesquite wood was burning, sending up columns of blue smoke that drifted over the camp like incense. The smell carried across the barbed wire, over the barracks, and out to the road where farmers passed on wagons. It was the smell of Texas itself, smoke, salt, sweetness, and slow forgiveness. Inside the kitchen, Earl seasoned the meat with salt and black pepper, brushing it with molasses and vinegar. The sizzle filled the air. Young MPs came to watch, drawn by the scent. "You cooking for them Kraut gals, Earl?" one asked with a smirk. Earl didn't look up. "I'm cooking for whoever's hungry." By noon, the camp was buzzing. The women were led to the mess hall, curious and wary. Some of the older German prisoners teased them. "Careful, they'll fatten you up before interrogation." But the guards were smiling now too, though they tried to hide it. There was something disarming about smoke and laughter in a place built for barbed wire and suspicion. Earl laid the platters out himself. Pork steaks, baked beans, cornbread, and a bucket of sweet tea sweating in the heat. The women filed in, their trays trembling in their hand. When they sat, they hesitated to take the first bite, unsure if it was allowed. Earl nodded once, and they began to eat. Slowly at first, then faster. The silence that followed wasn't discipline, it was emotion. Through the open doors, sunlight fell across their faces. A few lowered their heads, hands shaking as they chewed. Others covered their eyes. To eat something tender, something cooked with care, after years of fear, it was too much. One of them whispered a prayer. Another wept quietly into her napkin. Earl stood in the doorway, hat in hand, pretending to check the smoke outside. He didn't need to understand German to know what those tears meant. That night, as the embers cooled, a rumor spread through the camp. The women had cried over barbecue. Some guards laughed softly about it. Others went quiet. War had many fronts, but none stranger than this, a battlefield fought with kindness instead of bullets. And as the stars blinked over the Texas plains, Earl Whitman sat by his smoker, watching the last curls of smoke rise into the night, unaware that the simple act of cooking pork steaks had done what the world's generals could not. It had fed the enemy's humanity back to life. The sun bled into the Texas horizon, painting the camp fences in bronze and shadow. Dinner time came like a truce. The air was thick with mesquite smoke and the low hum of voices, American and German, divided by language but united by hunger. Inside the mess hall, lanterns glowed against wooden walls stained with years of grease and sweat. Tin trays clattered. Boots scuffed the floor. Outside, cicadas screamed in the heat, but inside, time had slowed, suspended in the scent of barbecue and buttered cornbread. The women entered quietly, single file, their pale blue uniforms washed clean but still marked by fatigue. They looked around, wary, unsure if this was a celebration or an experiment. Each held her tray close, fingers tense as if bracing for ridicule. The guards stood nearby, half curious, half protective. No one spoke. The silence before a meal had never felt so fragile. At the serving line, Earl Whitman moved with deliberate calm, his apron streaked with smoke and sauce. He looked each woman in the eye as he ladled beans or placed a pork steak on her tray. Some avoided his gaze, others met it and quickly looked away. He spoke little, just quiet words of habit. "Here you go, ma'am. Mind the hot plate." His voice carried no command, only warmth. When one of the younger women murmured a trembling "Danky," he gave a small nod. "You're welcome, miss. That's what we say around here." As they sat, the sounds of chairs scraping echoed like whispers. Steam rose from the plates. One woman hesitated, staring at the thick, glistening steak, its edges charred just right. The last time she'd seen meat was 2 years ago, before the bombings had turned her city to dust. She glanced at her companions, then took a cautious bite. The taste, smoky, sweet, impossibly tender, hit her like memory itself. She blinked hard, swallowing not just food but months of emptiness. Across the table, another woman laughed softly, startled by the sensation of flavor. It was a sound too delicate for a prison. The guard nearest the door, a boy from Kansas, smiled despite himself. "Guess they like it," he muttered. His superior gave a faint grunt. "Ain't the food that strange," the older man said. "It's the peace." The room filled slowly with the rhythm of forks and breathing. Someone whispered a prayer in German, another answered, "Amen." It was the first time those walls had heard that word spoken by prisoners. Earl lingered in the doorway, pretending to check the coffee urns. He watched the women eat, his face unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. The room's light flickered against his weathered skin, making him look carved from the same wood that held the building together. He'd cooked for roughnecks, cattle hands, and soldiers, but never for people who looked at food as if it might vanish mid-bite. It struck him suddenly that he was feeding not just their stomachs but their souls, starved of gentleness. For all his rough edges, Earl understood that hunger. He had seen it in drought years, in the eyes of his neighbors during the Depression. War, he thought, was just another kind of famine. One of the women, Greta, the nurse with steady eyes, lifted her head and looked toward the kitchen. "Who made this?" she asked in careful English. Earl hesitated, then stepped forward. "That'd be me, ma'am." A murmur passed through the group. Greta stood, her hand trembling as she raised her tray slightly in gratitude. "It is good," she said. Her accent made the word sound like something sacred. Earl tipped his hat. "Glad to hear it." The gesture was simple, but in that moment the whole room seemed to breathe differently. As dessert came, warm apple cobbler, served in chipped bowls, the mood shifted. The guards loosened, leaning against walls instead of standing stiffly. One offered a second helping, another poured extra coffee. The women began to talk softly among themselves, their voices fluttering like cautious birds. Laughter followed, small, hesitant but real. The camp's stillness cracked open, replaced by the fragile hum of shared humanity. The corporal from earlier, the one who had questioned Earl's kindness, stood in the doorway now, watching. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered. Earl didn't answer. He was watching Greta, who sat with her hands folded after eating, eyes glistening. She whispered something to her neighbor, who nodded and wiped her cheek. Later, Earl learned what she'd said. "My mother hasn't eaten meat since 1942. As the meal wound down, the women lingered over empty plates, reluctant to leave. The guards, unsure how to end a peace no one had declared, finally motioned them back toward the barracks. Chairs scraped again, echoing like distant thunder. When they stood, several women turned to the cooks and guards, nodding in silent thanks. It was an awkward, beautiful procession, captives leaving a feast they'd never forget. Outside, the evening had cooled. The camp lights glowed like distant stars. From the guard tower, the sky seemed endless, the fences small. The smell of barbecue still hung in the air, drifting beyond the wire toward the open plains. Somewhere, a whippoorwill called. Earl walked out to his smoker, its embers pulsing faintly in the dark. He leaned on the post beside it, staring at the horizon where the moon had begun to rise. Behind him, Captain Rusk approached. "You've stirred up something, Whitman," he said, his tone unreadable. Earl didn't turn. "Just supper, sir." Rusk's boots crunched the dirt. "No. You've gone and made them remember their people. That's a dangerous thing in wartime." Earl finally looked at him, eyes steady. "Maybe that's what'll end it one day." The captain said nothing, just walked away into the hum of generators and crickets. Later, in the women's barracks, the quiet was different, softer, alive. Someone began humming a lullaby, another joined in, and soon a faint chorus drifted through the night air. The guards listened without comment. One whispered, "Sounds like home," though none of them shared the same one. As the song faded, Greta lay awake staring at the wooden ceiling. She thought of her mother's kitchen, of laughter before sirens, of the smell of roasted apples. She thought of the man in the apron who looked at her not as a prisoner but as a person. For the first time since her capture, she prayed not for escape, but for understanding. Earl slept lightly that night. Just before dawn, he woke to the sound of distant thunder, or perhaps artillery, carried by imagination. He poured himself coffee, stepped outside, and found the camp still and calm. The sky was streaked with pink. Beyond the wire, the prairie stretched on forever, open and forgiving. He wondered if peace might taste like this: smoke, sugar, and silence after supper. He didn't know that years later, some of those women would tell their children about a night in Texas when the enemy fed them barbecue. He didn't know his act would ripple beyond the fences. All he knew, standing in that sunrise, was that the war had not won entirely. Not yet. And somewhere deep inside the camp, beneath the barbed wire and the dust, something stubborn and holy had survived: the simple, unarmed power of kindness. When the war ended, the news came not as a shout but as a hush. One morning in May 1945, the guards at Camp Hearn switched off the radio's mid-broadcast, and a strange quiet fell across the Texas prairie. The prisoners sensed it before they heard it. Something in the way the Americans stopped barking orders, the way even the wind seemed to pause. Word drifted through the barracks like smoke. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. Yet no one cheered. Some of the men sat down and stared at the floor. Others prayed. The women stood in small clusters, their eyes uncertain. Home, for them, was a word that had changed meaning. That evening, the sunset looked softer, less like fire. Earl Whitman leaned against the porch outside the mess hall, a cigarette glowing between his fingers. He had been cooking all day, habit, mostly. Even when the world ended, men still needed to eat. The camp smelled of cornbread and beans, though fewer guards came for supper now. Orders had come down to prepare for closures, transfers, repatriations. The fences would soon be cut, the watchtowers emptied. Earl exhaled smoke and watched the sky darken to purple. "So that's that," he murmured, as if the end of a world could be summed up in 4 words. The German women were quieter than ever. Without uniforms to press or rosters to copy, they wandered the yard in slow circles, clutching photographs, folding linens that no longer needed folding. Greta, the nurse, sat by the garden each morning, watering plants that had survived Texas heat better than most soldiers survived war. She had started teaching some of the younger girls English, trading words for stories. "Hope," she told them one day, "means nothing if you never had despair." A guard passing by overheard and didn't correct her grammar. Earl saw them less now, but when he did, he always tipped his hat. He had come to think of them not as enemy women, but simply as women, fragile, polite, homesick. He didn't know what would happen to them when they left. Rumor said the Allies were shipping POWs to Europe in waves, some straight into British custody, some into French labor camp. The irony wasn't lost on him. These girls had crossed an ocean as captives, and now they'd cross it again to rebuild the very places that had once tried to conquer the world. On their final Sunday in camp, the sky turned overcast, as if Texas itself mourned their leaving. Earl woke before dawn and lit the smoker one last time. He didn't tell anyone, not the captain, not the guards. He worked quietly, seasoning the meat by memory. The scent drifted through the camp, stirring a nostalgia too young to be history. By mid-morning, the women gathered outside the mess hall, drawn by instinct more than invitation. Earl stepped aside as they entered. "Ain't regulation," he said gruffly, "but it felt wrong not to cook something." The meal was simple, pork, beans, and bread, but the silence that filled the room was reverent. Some of the women pressed their hands to their hearts before eating. Greta whispered grace in German, her voice trembling. "For Frieden und für Brot," she said. "For peace and for bread." Earl nodded as if he understood. He didn't need a translation. He had prayed the same way all his life. After they ate, a few of the women approached him. One handed him a folded handkerchief embroidered with blue thread, tiny flowers, clumsy but careful. Another placed a small sketch in his hand. The mess hall, drawn from memory, smoke curling above it. Herself as Greta Muller, former prisoner number 3478. She was now a teacher, a mother, a grandmother. Her English was soft, elegant. "I remember the day you fed us," she wrote. "We had lost everything, our homes, our pride, even our names. But you looked at us as if we still belonged to the world. You made us believe kindness could exist without permission. I have told my students that story every year. They do not believe it at first. But then I tell them, I tasted it." Earl read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it in his Bible, between Psalms and Proverbs. He didn't write back. His eyes weren't much for writing anymore, but that night, he lit the smoker again. The smell filled the air, carried by the wind across fields that remembered more than men ever could. Some say neighbors saw him sitting there past midnight, watching the embers fade, his face lit red in the glow. Maybe he was thinking of the letter. Maybe he was thinking of the war. Or maybe he was thinking that a man's true monument isn't stone, it's the way his kindness echoes in those who once thought him their enemy. Long after Earl passed, local kids found the old smoker half buried in weed. They didn't know. "When you see this," she said, "remember we were here." He tried to thank them, but words felt too small. So he just said, "I'll keep it safe." That afternoon, trucks arrived to take the prisoners to the train station. The camp lined up to watch. The guards saluted, awkwardly but sincerely. A few of the women waved through tears. Greta looked back one last time. Earl stood by the gate, arms folded, his hat pressed to his chest. Their eyes met briefly across the wire, a glance that held no romance, only recognition. Then the convoy moved on, its engines fading into the Texas wind. 4 weeks afterward, the camp felt hollow. The mess hall echoed differently without the hum of foreign voices. Earl packed away his knives, cleaned the stove one last time, and locked the door behind him. When the army finally closed Camp Hearn, the buildings were dismantled, the fences sold for scrap. The prairie reclaimed the rest. But behind Earl's house, the smoker remained, rusting slowly under the open sky. Sometimes he'd light it on Sundays, letting the smoke drift over the fields like a ghost. Years passed. America changed. Highways cut through pastures where soldiers once marched. The war turned into film reels and textbooks. Earl grew older, his hands stiff with arthritis, his hat faded beyond recognition. He rarely spoke about the camp. When asked, he'd shrug and say, "Just cooked for whoever was hungry." But one winter morning in 1972, a letter arrived from Germany, Munich, postmarked with careful handwriting. It began simply, "To the cook at Camp Hearn." The writer identified herself as Greta Muller. An old woman still told her students about a Texas camp where she once cried over a plate of barbecue. And every time she did, she ended the lesson the same way: wars end with victory. But peace begins with supper. The camera would fade there, lingering on the rising smoke of memory, on the quiet fields where fences used to stand. But history doesn't end cleanly, it drifts. And somewhere out there, perhaps in another camp, another war, someone else was learning the same truth. That mercy, once given, never dies. It only waits for the next hungry soul to find its scent again.